Hello everyone. Today I want to talk about an idea which I use all the time, which I've taken from my background in mathematics and physics, but I've kind of widened to use it more general in the way that I look at the world. And this concept is the idea of what I will call multidimensional thinking. Basically, the first thing you have to understand that what you usually think about, or probably think about when you hear about the word dimension, is not the same what it is from the point of view of a physicist or a mathematician. In physics, I learned to also call it a degree of freedom, which maybe is a bit more helpful, because usually when you think about dimensions, you only think about things that are somehow related to space. But actually, in a mathematical sense, this understanding it's much wider than what you would understand as a dimension in space or any other way. And actually, also the concept of space is very different in mathematics than what you probably think it is. But I don't want to go too deep into all the mathematics of this. It is helpful to understand some of the mathematics to become better in multidimensional thinking, but if you're really interested in this, probably try to learn some linear algebra to start with, but we will talk about other things first. My goal is not to make you into a mathematician, but more to get some basic ideas on how to look at the world, which in this case originate in mathematics, and so that's all. And be aware that we this way will not use the full complexity of the possibilities, but it will already widen the way you look at things. So this way of understanding things as having more than one dimension or more than one degree of freedom basically means that you accept that things are influenced by a lot of different factors, and that those factors are something which you can isolate in understanding. Just to imagine this degree of freedom, basically it is anything. A degree of freedom is something which can be changed more or less independently of other properties of something, or probably can be looked at more or less independently of other properties. So for example, you could say, if I want to describe a person, one of these degrees of freedom would be their height, and then maybe also their width, and also how thick they are, or something like that. And then you already have something like space, 3 space dimensions. But then you can also say, well, I'm also interested in how heavy a person is, or what hair length a person has. You can even say if they have glasses or not. All those things you can use to describe a person just in a physical way. And all those things you can kind of treat like an independent dimension. Actually, it's probably not all independent, like my spatial dimensions, together with another thing you could describe is how much fat do I have in my body and how many muscles, and then I can probably already guess something about the weight. But for a simple analysis, just basically anything which you can draw a line on a piece of paper and place somewhere on that line where a specific object or person is at a specific point in time, you can kind of treat like a degree of freedom. What you often do if you are a bit more further in your analysis, you might look for something which is like the smallest number of degrees of freedom to describe what you want to describe or what you're looking at. And you might find that some things depend on each other, so that if you have 3 different properties, and then you find that actually 2 of them or 1 of them depends on the 2 others, and then actually to really describe things, you only need 2 and not 3. But this is already a bit further into the mathematical thinking, but it's something to be aware of. And so if you look at things this way, then it opens you up to accepting that most things aren't quite as one-dimensional, but quite as straightforward as you might think. But also that some things which you think are not straightforward actually are kind of straightforward if you just look at different dimensions. Because what often happens is that we tend to like things to just look at them in one scale. In the most extreme cases, we like to look at it in black and white. But if you look at things, then you might find that, well, actually a lot of those things, they're more complicated than that. For example, if you know how I feel about one area of politics, let's say about economic policy, well, what I feel about something like gay marriage is completely independent of this. Now, there is cases where political parties put those things together, and then you think, oh, if someone has this opinion on one subject, like economic policies, they also have the opinion on the other subject, because that's the party that's linked. But actually, those things don't have all that much to do with each other. So, accepting that things are more complicated than this, that it's more dimensional, there's more degrees of freedom, actually gives you more options to analyze things, because you can see, okay, how does this person feel about immigration policy? How do they feel about economic policy? How do they feel about individual rights, protection of individual rights? And then already you have 3 things which are more or less independent. They interact, of course, because immigration policy might influence economic policies, but still they're somewhat independent, because let's say if you talk about immigration, there's also moral reasons, for example, to have a certain opinion, and so even though there's a link, it's not completely dependent on each other. And so if you start, for example, looking at your own political opinions in that way, rather than just say, oh, I'm on the political left or on the political right, you just start looking at it by different subjects and saying, okay, in this subject, where am I? And then you might find that in some subjects you would match up with a more conservative party, and in other subjects you would match up with a more left-leaning party. And your whole picture of your own political opinion would be much wider. And the same if you talk to someone else, instead of just saying, oh, this person has this opinion, maybe because they voted for a certain party. If you look at it more dimensional, you see, okay, actually, they voted for a party because they agree in many things, or there was one thing they think very important, but in many opinions they probably are not that simple, and you cannot put them in that simple category. And so just starting to use this way of thinking, you will realize that you can accept much more complexity, for example, in political opinions or things like that. And this way of thinking, of course, is not limited to politics or anything. I mean, I use it, of course, looking at social phenomena. I look at it trying to understand economic phenomena, trying to understand scientific effects that you see. I've taken this from physics, so of course in physics this is used in many ways all the time. So I had to pick some examples, so that's what came to my mind right now. Now, if you start to doing this, just start doing it by practicing it, by looking, how can I, what's going on? Can I identify different things which influence something? You can also say, okay, can I see interactions? Because degrees of freedom aren't necessarily completely independent. It's possible that they are to a certain degree linked, as long as they are not completely linked. So as long as you cannot for sure say if someone has a certain that a certain degree of freedom is always linked to another one. Let's say with the politics, if you can say there is one opinion which, if someone holds in this question holds one opinion, let's say in monetary policy, that they 100% also have a certain opinion on the euro. Well, no, actually that's the same. On foreign relations, which I don't think this is linked, but if this was linked, then you would say, okay, I can reduce this to 1 degree of freedom. But of course, this is not linked, so it's just try to see, do I need actually the complexity? So practice, whenever you see something, you can just see, can I identify different aspects? Can I identify different influences? And are they linked or are they independent? If they're independent, they're for sure different degrees of freedom. If they're linked, I can say, okay, how strongly are they linked? And then can see if I look at it as 1 degree of freedom or if I look at it as separate degrees of freedom. When you do this, you will find that there is some limits, of course, to this, as to everything. And what I can see is there's 2 things happening. And you can actually see this in politics, because in a way, people are doing this, of course. I mean, they tend to simplify, looking at just one degree of freedom, one option about which you discuss, or where you try to fit every possible opinion. But also sometimes people try to argue, well, this is much too complex because this. And those are kind of the 2 extremes. Actually, in my experience, most things are somewhere in the middle. So for practical reasons, what you then have to do is you have to look, if there's different degrees of freedom, how necessary are they? And even more, how necessary are they for what I'm looking at right now? What do I mean? Let's say you're thinking about what's a good example? Well, let's say you're thinking about unemployment policies. And then someone says, yeah, but how is this related to climate change? Then you can say, well, actually, of course, there is some relationship to it, but this relationship probably isn't very large. So I will just ignore this dimension in my analysis because I don't need it. Of course, it depends a bit on what country you are in. I'm in Germany. At this point in time, the influence is not very big, so this is fine. Of course, if you live very close to the coast and sea levels are rising, and this affects your work at the coast, and this affects your work, then you cannot do this. So this is also something where you always have to look at the specific situation and have to see what is the relevant things here. And also be careful, because sometimes, especially in political discussions, people will try to kind of argue with things which probably are not that relevant. Actually, this is something you can see sometimes in discussions about climate change, or more specifically about how to react to climate change, because I think by now climate change is pretty much clear that it exists, and that it's most likely that humans are influencing it, and now there's a lot of discussions what to do about it. And then people will use a lot of arguments, and sometimes they will kind of try to use actually degrees of freedom in the whole thing, which are very small, instead of looking at the ones which are big. So be wary of this and try to see, okay, are the things, the aspects which are real, people are talking about, are they actually important in this respect? Because if you don't, then you're kind of over complexifying it, or you're focusing on the wrong things. So whenever you use this method, not only see, okay, what are the relevant degrees of freedom I'm looking at, but also look at, well, which ones are actually relevant here, which ones are large enough that they are relevant. Sometimes you might find that there's a lot of influences, but actually one or two are the only ones which really matter. Then you can just look at them, be aware that there's others and that they might become more important over time, but that they're probably not right now. Also be aware that the more precise you try to think about things, the more important those smaller aspects will become. The second problem, so that's kind of this first problem, or the problem I just described. It's kind of like a problem where you can kind of choose too many dimensions to have a usable analysis, because you kind of get lost in the wrong or in just too many aspects of a thing. The other problem is if you try to reduce everything to just one aspect. So what is the problem here? Well, the problem is that you kind of try, either you just ignore a lot of things, or you try to push a lot of things into one thing. A discussion which is currently going on somewhat, I think mostly in left politics, appears to me a little bit like that. So if I look at all the discussions surrounding the subject of gender, I sometimes feel that both sides actually are trying to just push it in one dimension, and that's why they actually are not able to really reflect the complexity of what's behind it, and to really act in a smart way. Because one side just tries to reduce it to one dimension and basically says whatever people are saying about it, it doesn't exist, it's all very simple, there's just two sexes, genders, whatever, and I don't want to think about it further. The other side kind of tries to reduce everything into one dimension as well, but in another dimension. And one thing they do is say, okay, some of them say biology is not that important, so they're just trying to throw out a dimension which obviously is quite important in this. The other thing is that they kind of try to put a lot of other personality traits into the term gender, and then they end up with a list with, I don't know what's, I've seen lists which had like 50 or more genders, and looking at them, I felt like actually some of them are definitely not what I would call gender, but it's more about kind of certain personality traits. And so by trying to put everything in one dimension, in one degree of freedom, which you call gender, you're actually not reflecting the full complexity of people. It would be much more useful to accept there's more than one dimension. So there's, for example, this is not an extensive list, but some of those dimensions are biological sex, which also is not the simple male-female thing, and which you actually also could separate into more dimensions. Then there's, of course, gender in the classical sense of social sex, and then there's other personality traits like sexual orientation, and a whole list you can go on. And of course this might seem a bit more complex, but I actually feel it's much easier and it's much better suited to really describe people than just trying to say we have to fit everything into one thing. And so now we come up with more and more categories, because basically all those categories are kind of just combinations of those different dimensions, and it's not really helpful. Not really helpful to understand things. Instead of just saying, well, there are certain categories, everyone deserves a right to be seen and to be respected. We accept that there is certain scientific facts around the whole thing, and then we will describe people a bit more dimensional, and still try to give them as many rights as anyone else has, and not try to say the whole discussion is just clear. And actually also this will probably make it easier for both sides to discuss, because if one side can accept, okay, there's more dimensions which I've tried to shove into one, and the other side is willing to accept, well, okay, I've tried to reduce it to one dimension, and maybe this dimension I chose is more or less correct, but I've ignored many other dimensions, then maybe it would be easier to find some common ground. Of course, people are strange, so it probably won't be easier, but from a sense of an analysis, I'm sure it will be easier. And as I said, for me, looking at things with this kind of point of view, I feel some of the discussions are a bit strange, because I feel a lot of them are kind of unnecessary if you just pick the right number of dimensions to analyze things. So with these examples, you can see that it is actually a little bit of an art to find the right complexity to look at things. Because if you look at things overly complex, you will get lost in the complexity, and you will not be able to make any decisions. On the other extreme, if you try to reduce things to too few dimensions, then you will overlook many things, and well, you will not be able to solve the problem either, because you don't have the right view. So the goal should always be, and this is not only with multidimensional thinking but in general, it's always try to find the level of complexity looking at something which is most suited for the purpose you have at this moment, which might be either just understanding it or actually solving some problem. And this might also lead to different levels of complexity. You can usually, if you really want to understand something, you'll want a bit more complexity than if you just want to solve a problem. If you want to solve a problem, you just need enough complexity to be sure that there's no surprising effects which you've overlooked, and you can even say, okay, I only want to solve it within a certain margin, so you don't need to be 100% sure, but if you're like 95% sure about how things will react, then for many problems this might actually be enough. If you want to understand it, then you will want to know a little bit more, so you will of course go into a bit more depth. Okay, so I've talked a long time already. I will stop here for now. Let me know if you're interested more about this kind of subject, and if you want to hear more about multidimensional thinking, if you want to hear about specific examples or other subjects you would like me to talk about. As always, if you like this channel, please share it. Share this video with your friends if you think it will help them. Send me feedback. And well, everyone take care, and until next time, goodbye.